final talk of the day. I'm gonna talk about the way out of all that, because we're going round on this wheel. I've said there's a gap, but how do we use that gap? How do we get off this wheel? So that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Amoghavajra tomorrow actually will be talking about the 6 realms, which in a way is a slightly separate topic, in the sense it doesn't connect with the Nidana chain, the negative and the positive. So that's okay. We arranged it that way because he was doing the morning session and was unavailable till, well, at least this afternoon, perhaps tomorrow. Okay, so that's the regular morning session. I know we had a morning session. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this so-called spiral path, the positive Nidana chain. You find it in Buddhist, in the Buddhist literature, which is vast. There seems to be an emphasis on this cyclic Nidana chain. Not much is said about the positive Nidana chain, the way out of suffering, which Sangharakshita called the spiral path, which is probably quite a good image or a good description of it. And the links on this spiral path. So what we'll have a look at, let's hope I can share the screen. Yeah, good. The spiral path. And I'm going to talk about 2 versions of this. Very similar, although one's got a few more links in it than others. I'll just say before I do that, compare the 2 compare the 2 paths. That this one is from a text called the Upanishad Sutta, which is Upanishad means cause, basis, conditions, prerequisite for. It's a very similar word to, you might have heard of the Upanishads, which are teachings that go back before the time of the Buddha. So yeah, so that means prerequisites or conditions. And this is from the sutta in the Pali Canon. So let's go at the bottom. From the sutta in the Pali Canon. Whereas the other sutta is from a Chinese translation. Because I'll just say a little about this. It's quite interesting that you know, Buddhism originated in India and it spread, and in time it spread southwards to Sri Lanka, and that's where the so-called Pali Canon was written down, probably about 400 years after the Buddha, we think. But also the teaching spread, would it be north and west to China? And the Indian language, or whatever the Indian language these texts are in, got translated into Chinese. And as some of you are aware, Buddhism died out in India for various reasons, and a succession of invaders destroyed the monasteries, destroyed the texts. So the original Indian texts were lost, but they've been translated into Chinese, and in recent years, very clever people, scholars, have been translating these Chinese texts back into, well, into English, into Western languages. Not many people can do that. It's only a handful, and I reckon there's a vast selection of these texts, and I probably reckon within a couple of 100 years I'll probably have finished. So there's a way to go on this, but it's quite new stuff. And what these texts agree quite closely, not exactly, quite closely with those in the Pali Canon. So these two strands of Buddhist knowledge separated, well, 2,000 years ago or thereabouts. And so it shows the teachings are fairly valid, and but they're not exactly the same. And I'll just show in this case these two versions. So this is the spiral path from the Pali Canon, the Upanishad Sutta. So I talked about dukkha this morning. You find that, and you're probably all aware of what that is, the unsatisfactoriness. Life being a bumpy ride is what I said I quite like. And that gives rise to faith. And you might think, well, how does it? But I'll come to that in a bit. Faith leads to joy. These are the links in this positive Nidana chain as in this sutta. Joy leads to rapture. Rapture leads to calm. Calm leads to bliss. Bliss leads to samadhi, sometimes translated as concentration. Samadhi leads to knowledge and vision of things as they really are, insight, in other words. And this leads to withdrawal, leads to dispassion, leads to liberation, and knowledge of its destructions and the mental poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion. Equivalent to nirvana. That really means nirvana. Once you've got that far, you're liberated from these three poisons, and you know you are. So you've reached this state of nirvana, as it's called. So I'll go through this in a bit, but I'll just show you the other one. I think it's on here. I hope it is. Where are we? Go down. There we go. The spiral path from the Chinese translation. And you'll see here, and this is why I like this one, I prefer this one in a way, because although it starts with dukkha and then goes on to faith, you've then got right attention, right mindfulness, and right attentiveness, and guarding the senses, guarding the gates of the senses, keeping the precepts, being without regret, which then leads to joy, which leads to, well, the others come into effect then. It's essentially the same after. But this sutta, well, it's not sutta, they're called agamas, the Chinese translations. Agamas. And you'll see here that there's an ethical aspect to this. It's not mentioned in the other one. It's not mentioned, it's perhaps implied, but it's usually translated as you need to have this, keep the precepts, being without regret, but being without remorse. And that leads to joy. So I'll come back to that. So there we are, there's the two translations. I might, if we've got time, actually read this. Read the sutta. They're only short text, so we could try and do that. Well, there we go. Let's stop that share. So, in fact, you can see in that translation. I've got rid of it now. But you've probably, some of you at least, have heard of the threefold way: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And you can see in that translation, you've got the ethics, haven't you? It's spelled out there in those links. And then you've got samadhi, meditation. You've got meditation, and then that leads to wisdom, knowledge of things as they really are. Okay. I've got another screen share here that I'll show you. This is going from Sadaraja, who did that nice Wheel of Life. Can you see that? And it's sort of it's a diagram showing that link between feeling and craving, it comes out of there. So yeah, Yes, you've got mindfulness leading to investigation of mental states. It's a um, slightly different sequence there, but that's a diagram that shows that that's a weak point in the chain, and that's where we can get off the wheel. So this spiral path, it can be represented as it is there, as emerging from the gap between feeling and craving, leading away from the mechanical repetitions of the reactive mind. Okay, so we've heard about quite a bit about dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, or life's a bumpy ride. Life has its ups and downs. We're blown around by the worldly winds, which was a topic I talked about last Saturday morning. And we can become dissatisfied with this state of affairs. Um, we don't want all this bump. We don't want a bumpy ride. We want a smooth ride. So what do we do? This dukkha leads to faith in the sequence. And this is not blind faith, it's confidence or trust. Confidence in the validity of the Buddha's teaching. Now, how does faith arise out of dukkha? You might be wondering that. It's obviously not obvious. But if we imagine that dukkha um, gives us the impression, or we know about the insecurity of the human condition, life as we normally lead it, or we feel that life lacks meaning, we may come across the teachings of the Buddha, if we're lucky, and we find they make sense. It's in accord with our lived experience. So this confidence or faith in the Buddhist path arises. So conditions, it's all about conditionality. Conditions have been favourable for this to occur. So you're getting a bit fed up with life's ups and downs. You want a smoother ride. You come across the teachings of the Buddha, and those conditions lead us to having faith in the teachings, and we decide to follow the path. Okay, well, the next one, perhaps I have the diagram up again. Where are we? Share screen, and oh yeah, I've got another diagram here. I'll just show that because it shows the same thing really. Again, this is not exactly the same, but we're talking about, you can see it's a different sort of scheme, but or schematic representation. So you can see there on the left, you've got the cyclic nidana chain, and then leads to suffering. They're conditions that lead to suffering. And then on the right, we've got the positive nidana chain. Faith leads, well, it's different terminology sometimes, but it's essentially the same. We'll look at the Pali version. But remember that the Chinese version has got this ethical dimension to it. Okay, well, let's go through these then. So dukkha, we talked about dukkha, and talked about how faith arises. We're fed up with dukkha. We want to get rid of it. We want to, we want a smooth ride in life, and we hear the teachings of the Buddha, and we see they make sense. So we got faith in these teachings, and we decide to follow them. Okay. So the next step on the path, joy, or pamodja in Pali. So this leads to, the faith. Out of the faith arises happiness, hope, optimism. And as we've got faith in the Buddha's path, we're optimistic, we've got hope. And living skillfully by keeping the precepts leads to freedom from remorse. The joy of a clear conscience. So as I said, that's why I showed you the Chinese version because it clearly talks about keeping the precepts leading to freedom from remorse, leading to joy of a clear conscience, and all the other conditions which lead to this idea of joy. So now we go next. The next thing on this step, on this path, is rapture, or piti, P-I-T-I in Pali. And this comes out of the joy. It's this physical thrill. It's a sort of a physical thing as well as mental. Because with joy, that gives rise to a release of energy, coming from positive states of mind and behaviors. And it's a kind of liberation of emotional energies which have been sort of locked up in deep-seated conflicts in the depths of our consciousness. So these emotional energies being put in positive, viewed in positive states of mind and behaviours. I have heard that it corresponds to a dopamine release. Okay, so you can intertwine a bit of science into this, but it might well be. You don't know. Well, they might know. I don't know if the work's been done on that. So then that leads to where are we? We're in rapture, piti, and that leads to tranquility. So in dependence on rapture arises calm, peace, or tranquility. The physical component of this rapture, this feeling of this liberation of emotional energies, that calms down, our bodies relax, and our minds enjoy a calm tranquility. And that leads to bliss, or sukha, rather than dukkha. And sukha is the opposite of dukkha. So leads to bliss. Independence upon tranquility arises bliss, which is a feeling of intense happiness due to this unification of our emotional energies, our deep-seated emotional energies. Our energies are flowing in the same direction. They're like a great river flowing. We've built up some momentum. And it leads to this bliss, this intense happiness. I was listening to a talk a while ago, and somebody said that's when the dopamine release runs, or the dopamine runs out, and there's a release of endorphins, which is an interesting take on it. So we're at that point, natural release of these things, these neurotransmitters, these blissful experiences arise naturally. Okay. So out of this arises samadhi. And that's usually translated as concentration. Concentration is not, well, it's a word that's usually used, but concentration can imply a sort of a forced focus on a particular object. But it's not really like that. Forcing your attention on something is not going to lead to these higher states of mind. It's a sort of a healthy pointedness of mind due to the unification energies. So that is samadhi. And out of that arises, now we're really getting somewhere, arises knowledge and vision of the true nature of reality. Or it says here, of things as they really are. That's probably a better translation, actually. The Pali is Yathabhuta Nanadasana. You can impress your friends with that one. Knowledge and vision as things as they really are. Um, so we're getting somewhere now. That is a stage of insight, if you like. We've developed insight. Um, I think it corresponds to what's said in traditional Buddhism, stream entry, um, or we could say a rising of um, what's the word? Bodhicitta in later Buddhist ideas, rising the bodhicitta or stream entry. Okay, so then we're in a position of we can't fall back from this. So from that samadhi, we get this insight knowledge, and we no longer seek satisfaction in things that are bound to disappointment. You know, the penny's dropped. It's like a still lake. It reflects things as they are, mirror-like wisdom. And this is a very important step. You know, as I said, it corresponds to stream entry, a point of no return. Um, I just got the sun in the eyes. I said this would happen. I'm all right at the moment. Um, Actually, that reminded me of of a of a text that some of us were looking at recently. Swadeepa was one who's here, called The Magic Show. And what would you say, analogy, so, for instance, the story tells of somebody who, there was a famous magician. Yeah, I won't go through the whole story, just a summary of it. There's a famous magician who drew large crowds, and he was coming to this town, and you wanted to see him. So you went along to see him, along with the other people in the crowd. You'd seen him before, and very impressive, his magic. But this time you're a bit sneaky, and you took the stage, creep behind the stage, and you see that this magic is really it's just a succession of tricks. You can see that the false bottoms in his boxers, wires leading to pull things around, and you see it's not magic at all. It's just creating an illusion. So through sort of you've seen through the whole show, and you can't go back to thinking of it as real magic, can you? You've seen through it. So that's a sort of analogy for once you see things as you really are, you can't go back to ignorance. I think that's what that story is trying to show. That yeah, right. So the next one, withdrawal on Nibbeda. So seeing how dukkha has arisen through spiritual ignorance from the cycle of samsara, this cycle has been broken because you can see for the first time really how this dukkha arises through the cyclic nidana chain. You can really see that, and you won't go back to it. And we can see how things are not dependable as they're constantly changing. So we no longer seek after them. So that's a withdrawal. You know, there's no longer wish for gratification of desires. So not the source of any lasting satisfaction. You know, we may have been aware of this all along, but we hadn't acted upon it. I think it's one of the examples of Sangharakshita's famous phrase, finding emotional equivalence of our intellectual understanding. You know, we could see, this cyclic chain of events, and we could see what it's getting at, but we don't act in according with us because that hasn't really sunk in. So after that, dispassion viraga. So again, have we seen how dukkha arises, suffering arises? So we become detached from these worldly things that used to enchant us. Now, not in the sense of indifference or insensitivity, it's a kind of serene imperturbability. Um, yeah. So we're detached from these things that we used to or have faith in. We can see through it all. We've seen how the magician can trick us. Right? Come down. There we are. So where are we? Withdraw dispassion. So we're getting there now. We're nearly there. Liberation or freedom from suffering, um, spiritual freedom. We no longer have this inevitability of suffering. And the final step is knowledge of the destructions of the mental poisons. Having knowledge that one is liberated, the end of the path, nirvana. The mental poisons being greed, hatred, and delusion, which we came across right at the start of this exploration of the wheel in the hub, the pig, the snake, and the pig, snake, and cockerel, bird. And the Buddha, I'll just quote the Buddha here at the end of this particular text. And this is an image he gives in more than one place. I'll read it out because the Buddha obviously thought that it sums things up. And it's an image of the rain. He says, this is a quote from the sutta, just as monks, when it rains huge drops on the tops of mountains, the water pouring down the slopes fills the branching clefts of mountain gullies. The full up branching clefts of mountain gullies fill up ponds. The full up ponds fill up lakes. The full up lakes fill up streams. The full up streams fill up rivers. And the full up rivers fill up the great ocean. So you've got this flow from, drops of rain on top of the mountain. You've built up all this momentum and ending up in the great ocean, the sea. And he says, likewise with ignorance. With ignorance as their conditions, there are formations. And how did it go? There's consciousness, and then there's name of what we looked at this morning, and up and including what we're looking at this afternoon. And he finally says, and with liberation as its condition, there is knowledge about waning. That is knowledge of the destructions of mental poisons. So I'd just like to mention another text here called the Chetana Sutta. And this is interesting because Chetana means will, and the sutta is the act of will. And it goes along the lines of, and this is the relevant bit, for a person free from remorse, there is no need for an act of will. It is the nature of things that joy arises in a person free from remorse. For a joyful person, there is no need for an act of will. It is in the nature of things that rapture arises in a joyful person, and so on up to nirvana. So what he's saying here, you set up the conditions and things will naturally unfold. And I think that's quite a good way of looking at the Buddhist practice, not just in this context, but if you set up the conditions, things will unfold. Like if you go on a retreat, you're with people in a quiet place in the countryside usually. You're all there for a particular purpose. You've all got the same ideals in life. You set up the conditions, and you usually have a really enjoyable time. You know, you set up the conditions, and these things will unfold from that. I thought to finish off with, I'll read a sutta. It'll only take about 10 minutes. It's quite a short one. I thought that would finish up, and as you can see, I'm in bright sunlight at the moment. Yeah, so in fact, I'll read the the discourse. It's called Discourse on Nirvana, and this is the Chinese version. Okay, and I talked this morning about the discovery sequence of conditions and the presentation sequence. This is the discovery sequence. So I'll read it in full just to sum up what we've been talking about, or what we've been learning about with the cyclic and the positive Nidana chain. Thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was staying at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's Park. At that time, the world-honoured one, that's the Buddha, addressed the monks. The attainment of nirvana is conditioned. It is not without condition. By what is the attainment of nirvana conditioned? The answer is, the attainment of nirvana is conditioned by liberation. Liberation too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is liberation conditioned? The answer is, liberation is conditioned by dispassion. Dispassion too is conditioned. It is not without conditions. By what is dispassion conditioned? The answer is, dispassion is conditioned by disenchantment. Disenchantment too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is disenchantment conditioned? The answer is, disenchantment is conditioned by seeing and knowing things as they really are. Seeing and knowing things as they really are is conditioned too. It's not without conditions. By what is seeing and knowing things as they really are conditioned? The answer is, seeing and knowing things as they really are is conditioned by concentration. Concentration too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is concentration conditioned? The answer too, concentration is conditioned by happiness. Happiness too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is happiness conditioned? The answer is, happiness is conditioned by tranquility. Tranquility too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is tranquility conditioned? The answer is, tranquility is conditioned by rapture. Rapture too is conditioned. It is not without conditions. By what is rapture conditioned? The answer is, rapture is conditioned by joy. Joy too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is joy conditioned? The answer is, joy is conditioned by being without regret. Being without regret is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is being without regret conditioned? The answer is, being without regret is conditioned by keeping the precepts. Keeping the precepts too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is keeping the precepts conditioned? The answer is, keeping the precepts is conditioned by guarding the sense facilities. Guarding the sense facilities too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is guarding the sense facilities conditioned? The answer is, guarding the sense facilities is conditioned by right mindfulness and right attentiveness. Right mindfulness and right attentiveness too are conditioned. They are not without conditions. By what are right mindfulness and right attentiveness conditioned? The answer is right mindfulness and right attentiveness is conditioned by right attention. Right attention too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is right attention conditioned? The answer is right attention is conditioned by faith. Faith too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is faith conditioned? The answer is faith is conditioned by suffering. Suffering too is conditioned. It is not without conditions. By what is suffering conditioned? The answer is suffering is conditioned by old age and death. Old age and death too are conditioned. They are not without conditions. By what are old age and death conditioned? The answer is old age and death are conditioned by birth. Birth too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is birth conditioned? The answer is birth is conditioned by the process of existence. The process of existence too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is the process of existence conditioned? The answer is the process of existence is conditioned by clinging. Clinging too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is clinging conditioned? The answer is clinging is conditioned by craving. Craving too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is craving conditioned? The answer is craving is conditioned by feeling. Feeling too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is feeling conditioned? The answer is feeling is conditioned by contact. Contact too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is contact conditioned? The answer is contact is conditioned by the six senses. The six senses too are conditioned. They are not without conditions. By what are the six senses conditioned? The answer is the six senses are conditioned by name and form. Name and form too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is name and form conditioned? The answer is name and form is conditioned by consciousness. Consciousness too is conditioned. It's not without conditions. By what is consciousness conditioned? The answer is consciousness is conditioned by karmic formations. Karmic formations too are conditioned. They are not without conditions. By what are karmic conditions, but karmic formations conditioned? The answer is karmic formations are conditioned by ignorance. This is what the Buddhas said. Having heard the Buddha's words, the monks were delighted and remembered them well. Yeah, so there you go. You've heard the Buddha's words, be delighted and remember them well. All right. So I'll finish there. Okay.